This is the moment Xi Jinping's most carefully constructed energy strategy collapsed. Not because of American sanctions, not because of Western pressure, not because of anything Beijing's enemies did to it. Because of something Beijing's closest partner did to itself. For 6 years, China had been building what its own state planners described as the most important energy relationship in its modern history. A direct, sanctions-busting, dollar-bypassing oil pipeline from Iran to China, conducted through shadow fleets, alternative payment systems, and a financial architecture specifically designed to make American pressure irrelevant. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Iranian crude moving into Chinese refineries every single year. Cheap oil that gave Beijing an economic advantage its rivals could not match, and a geopolitical lever its diplomats could use in every negotiation with Washington. It was supposed to be untouchable, designed to be unstoppable, and it worked until the tankers stopped moving. Right now, in the Strait of Hormuz, dozens of tankers that were carrying Iranian crude bound for Chinese ports are sitting idle, anchored, going nowhere. Not because of American interdiction, not because of new sanctions, because Iran mined the strait that its own oil exports depend on, and the same waterway that China built its entire discounted energy strategy around is now the most dangerous 21 miles of ocean on the planet. Xi Jinping woke up to a crisis his government had no role in creating and no clean way to resolve. The leverage he spent 6 years building, cheap Iranian oil that freed China from American energy pressure, has stalled in a body of water controlled by an ally Beijing cannot publicly criticize, cannot privately redirect, and cannot replace on any timeline that matters to its economy. In this breakdown, we go through exactly how China built this Iran oil dependency, what it is costing Beijing per day as the tankers sit idle, why Xi cannot pressure Iran without destroying the alliance he needs, why he cannot stay silent without absorbing economic damage his domestic economy cannot afford, and why this crisis has handed Washington a gift it did not plan for, did not earn, and is now trying to figure out how to use. This is not a story about stalled tankers. This is a story about the day China's most important energy gamble ran directly into China's most important geopolitical relationship, and both lost. 6 years ago, Beijing made a calculation that seemed, at the time, like a masterstroke. The United States had reimposed maximum pressure sanctions on Iran following the withdrawal from the JCPOA nuclear deal. Iranian oil exports had collapsed from 2.5 million barrels per day to under 400,000 barrels per day, as most of the world's buyers, terrified of American secondary sanctions, refused to touch Iranian crude regardless of its price. China looked at that situation and saw opportunity. While every other major oil buyer was walking away from Iran, Beijing was walking toward it. Chinese state refineries, particularly the independent refiners in Shandong province known as teapot refineries, began absorbing Iranian crude at prices that were sometimes $20 to $30 per barrel below international market rates. The discount existed because Iran had almost no one else willing to buy, and China was willing to buy everything Iran could export. The payment architecture was equally sophisticated. Iranian oil was not purchased in dollars. It moved through a network of front companies, intermediary accounts in third countries, and eventually settled in yuan or through barter arrangements involving Chinese manufactured goods. American sanctions monitors could identify the flows. They could not stop them without triggering secondary sanctions on Chinese entities. A step that would have meant declaring economic war on the world's second largest economy at a moment when Washington had other priorities. He promised that China's energy security would never again be vulnerable to American pressure or market disruption. He promised that the Belt and Road Initiative, the Yuan internationalization project, and the Iran oil relationship together created a self-sufficient energy architecture that insulated China from Western leverage. He promised that Beijing's partnership with Tehran was a cornerstone of the multipolar world order China was building, an order where American sanctions were one country's tool, not the world's law. But the cost of that promise was a structural dependency that nobody in Beijing's planning apparatus had fully stress-tested. By 2025, China was importing approximately 1.5 million barrels of Iranian crude per day, accounting for roughly 14% of China's total oil imports. That number had crept upward year by year as the relationship deepened, the discount remained attractive, and the alternative of paying full market price for oil from other suppliers was never forced by any actual supply crisis. The gamble was that Iran would remain a stable, albeit complicated supplier, that the geopolitical risks of the partnership were manageable because China was not taking sides in any conflict. It was simply buying oil. That Tehran and Beijing's shared interest in undermining American sanctions provided enough mutual incentive to keep the relationship functional regardless of whatever else was happening in the region. Tehran then mined the strait its own oil transits through, and the gamble dissolved in the same water the tankers were trying to cross. The morning after the first confirmed mine strike on the MT Aegean Star, China's National Energy Administration convened an emergency review. The agenda was straightforward and the findings were immediate. 31 tankers carrying Iranian crude bound for Chinese ports were currently in the Persian Gulf transit zone. Of those 31 vessels, 19 had already altered course or anchored in waiting positions outside the confirmed mine risk area. 12 were still moving, but operating under the same insurance suspension that had frozen the broader commercial shipping market. Effectively overnight, 1.5 million barrels of daily Chinese oil supply had gone from a functioning, discount-priced, sanctions-busting energy relationship to a logistical problem with no clear resolution timeline. The financial impact was immediate and specific. China's teapot refineries in Shandong province, which had built their entire business model around cheap Iranian crude and had invested billions in infrastructure specifically calibrated to process Iranian oil's unique chemical composition, began reducing throughput within 48 hours of the minefield being confirmed. They could not simply substitute Saudi or Iraqi or Russian crude at short notice. The refinery chemistry does not work that way. Retooling takes time, and time was exactly what the crisis was not providing. Pause. China had spent 6 years building a dependency so deep that its refineries were physically specialized to process a specific country's oil. When that oil stopped moving, the refineries did not just lose supply. They lost the ability to substitute supply without expensive and time-consuming infrastructure modification. The dependency was not merely financial, it was industrial. While the refinery throughput crisis was building in Shandong, something else was also happening simultaneously in China's oil futures markets. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange, China's own crude oil futures platform, launched specifically to create a yuan-denominated alternative to Western oil pricing benchmarks, was recording price movements that directly contradicted the narrative Beijing had spent years building about its energy independence. Chinese crude futures spiked alongside Brent and WTI, demonstrating in real time that China's alternative energy architecture was not insulated from the same supply disruptions affecting the Western markets it was designed to replace. And while the futures markets were exposing the limits of China's energy independence narrative, something else was also happening at that exact same moment in the diplomatic communications between Beijing and Tehran. China's foreign ministry had sent urgent back-channel messages to Iranian counterparts within hours of the minefield being confirmed. Not publicly, not through official statements, but through the quiet diplomatic channels that define how Beijing prefers to conduct sensitive communications. The content of those messages has not been disclosed. But the Iranian response, or rather, the absence of any Iranian response that changed the operational situation, was itself a message. Tehran was not unaware of the damage being inflicted on its most important economic relationship. It had calculated that the strategic objective of the mine operation, demonstrating to the world that the Strait of Hormuz could be disrupted at will, was worth the short-term cost to its relationship with Beijing. Iran had decided the demonstration mattered more than China's supply chain. That calculation, and the fact that Beijing could not change it, revealed something fundamental about the actual power dynamic in the China-Iran relationship that years of official partnership language had obscured. Here is what is not in any official statement from either Beijing or Tehran. Inside China's State Council energy planning apparatus, the Iran oil dependency had been a subject of internal concern for at least 3 years before the current crisis. Multiple internal assessments, produced by China's National Development and Reform Commission and its energy security research institutions, had flagged the structural risk of allowing any single supplier to account for more than 10% of total imports, particularly a supplier whose export routes ran through a single contested choke point. The 10% concentration threshold had been exceeded. The risk had been documented, and the cheap oil discount had consistently won the internal argument against diversification. According to sources familiar with Beijing's energy planning debates, The faction within the State Council that had argued for reducing Iran dependency had used precisely this scenario: a Hormuz disruption caused by Iranian action that China could neither prevent nor publicly oppose as its central warning. That faction was overruled repeatedly because the economics of cheap Iranian crude were too attractive, and the relationship with Tehran was considered too strategically valuable to subordinate to supply chain risk management. Those officials are not celebrating being right. They are managing the consequences of having been overruled. The diplomatic bind is equally severe and equally undiscussed in official channels. China cannot publicly pressure Iran to reopen the Strait because doing so would align Beijing with Washington's position, destroying the strategic value of the partnership that China built specifically to signal its independence from American foreign policy preferences. Every Chinese statement calling for de-escalation is carefully worded to avoid placing responsibility on Tehran, even as Iran's action is directly costing China money, supply, and credibility. One senior analyst familiar with Beijing's internal foreign policy debates described China's position with precision. They are paying the price of an alliance they cannot criticize and cannot afford to lose, for a crisis they did not cause and cannot solve. That is the definition of leverage running in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, Washington has noticed. Senior American trade and national security officials who had spent months managing the political and economic costs of maximum pressure on Iran woke up to a situation in which Iran had simultaneously disrupted China's energy supply, exposed the limits of the China-Iran partnership, and created a set of economic pressures on Beijing that no American sanction had managed to produce. The situation was not planned by Washington, but it was being observed with considerable interest. Follow the economics and the strategic picture becomes stark. Every day the Iranian crude supply to China is disrupted, Beijing faces a choice between three equally unattractive options. Option 1, wait for the Hormuz situation to resolve and absorb the supply gap through reduced refinery throughput and higher domestic energy costs. Option 2, replace Iranian crude with oil from alternative suppliers at full market price, paying a premium of $20 to $30 per barrel above what it had been paying Tehran, at volumes large enough to cover 14% of national import needs. Option 3, use its diplomatic relationship with Iran to pressure for a resolution, publicly acknowledging that Beijing's interests and Tehran's strategic objectives have come into conflict. Each option carries a cost that undermines a different pillar of the strategy Xi had built. Option 1 means accepting economic damage passively while projecting the image of a powerless bystander. Option 2 means paying the full market price for oil, eliminating the economic advantage that made the Iran relationship worth its geopolitical risks in the first place. Option 3 means publicly demonstrating that the China-Iran Comprehensive Strategic Partnership does not actually give Beijing the ability to influence Iranian decision-making on matters of Iranian strategic interest. Here is the power shift that this crisis has produced. Washington has spent years arguing that China's partnership with Iran gives Beijing leverage over Tehran that it refuses to use, and that China should use that leverage to moderate Iranian behavior. China has consistently denied having that leverage, arguing that its relationship with Iran is economic, not coercive. The Hormuz crisis has now provided empirical evidence that the Chinese position was accurate. Beijing does not have the leverage it was assumed to have. But that evidence, while it vindicates China's diplomatic position, simultaneously demonstrates that the China-Iran relationship is far less strategically valuable to Beijing than it appeared when Iran was a compliant supplier rather than an active disruptor. The economic numbers make the damage concrete. China imports approximately 11 million barrels of oil per day total. Iranian crude at 1.5 million barrels per day represents 14% of that total. A $30 premium on replacement supply, assuming it could be sourced at speed from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, or Russia, translates to approximately $45 million per day in additional energy costs. Per month, that is $135 billion. Per quarter, it approaches $4 billion. Against the backdrop of an already slowing Chinese economy facing deflationary pressure and a property sector crisis that has not fully resolved, that additional energy cost burden lands on an economy that is not positioned to absorb it without consequence. The domino effect from China's stalled Iran oil link is already moving across multiple fronts simultaneously. China's industrial sector, which had been running on the margin of profitability provided by cheap Iranian energy inputs, is now facing input cost increases that compress margins in export-oriented manufacturing. Electronics, steel, chemicals, textiles, the entire industrial supply chain that makes Chinese exports price competitive in global markets runs on energy, and that energy just got more expensive with no clear timeline for normalization. The political dimension inside China is sensitive in ways that Beijing is not acknowledging publicly. Xi Jinping built a significant portion of his energy security narrative on the Iran relationship. The Belt and Road Initiative's energy component, the Yuan oil trade framework, the demonstration that China could source energy outside Western-controlled markets and Western-dominated pricing systems, all of it used Iran as a central example. A public acknowledgement that the Iran relationship has created a structural vulnerability rather than a strategic advantage would require a revision of that narrative that carries domestic political cost. Foreign governments are watching Beijing's response with a specific question in mind. Not whether China can manage this supply disruption, but whether it will use its relationship with Iran to push for resolution. If Beijing makes a visible diplomatic effort to pressure Tehran toward Hormuz de-escalation, it validates the Western argument that China has leverage over Iran and should use it. If Beijing stays passive, it absorbs the economic cost while projecting strategic helplessness. Neither option is comfortable, and every capital watching is taking notes. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, are observing something they consider quietly significant. China had spent years cultivating relationships with Gulf energy producers as an alternative to its Iran dependency, but had never fully committed to that alternative because the Iranian discount was too attractive. The Hormuz crisis has produced the first clear demonstration that China's Iran bet came with risks its Gulf alternative relationships did not. Saudi Aramco and Abu Dhabi National Oil Company officials are aware of this. Their negotiations with Beijing over future supply contracts will reflect it. Washington is sitting on a strategic windfall it did not manufacture. The maximum pressure campaign on Iran had always been partly designed to stress the China-Iran relationship by making Iranian oil as difficult as possible to use. It never fully worked because China absorbed the sanctions risk. The Hormuz crisis achieved in days what years of sanctions pressure could not. It made Iranian oil physically impossible to move, created direct economic damage to Beijing, and exposed the limits of the China-Iran partnership in a way that no American diplomatic argument had managed to demonstrate convincingly. The stalled tankers in the Strait of Hormuz are not just ships waiting for a waterway to clear. They are a symbol of the gap between the strategy Xi Jinping built and the reality that strategy is now operating inside. A strategy designed for a world where China controlled its energy relationships, where its partnerships were sources of strength, and where American pressure could be absorbed through alternative architectures. The tankers represent the moment that architecture ran into a variable it had not modeled, an ally whose strategic interests diverged from Beijing's at the exact moment that divergence was most costly. You can build a sanctions-proof oil supply chain. You cannot build a conflict-proof one. You can design payment systems that bypass the dollar. You cannot design a strait that bypasses geography. You can cultivate an alliance with a country willing to defy American pressure. You cannot guarantee that same country's strategic decisions will always align with your economic interests. So where does this go from here? Watch Beijing's next diplomatic move toward Tehran. If China makes a public statement that goes beyond generic calls for de-escalation and specifically addresses the impact of the Hormuz disruption on bilateral economic relationships, it is acknowledging, for the first time officially, that the China-Iran partnership has a tension point that Beijing is willing to name. That would be a significant shift in how Beijing communicates about the relationship and would signal that the economic damage has crossed a threshold that outweighs the diplomatic cost of transparency. Watch China's emergency oil procurement activity in the Gulf and Russia. If Beijing moves with speed and volume to replace Iranian crude through Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or expanded Russian supply, the market signals will be visible in tanker booking data and in the pricing of alternative crude grades within 2 to 3 weeks. Those signals will tell us whether China has decided to absorb short-term costs to reduce its Iran dependency, a strategic recalibration that would permanently change the dynamic of the relationship. Watch Xi Jinping's domestic energy policy communications. If the Iran dependency narrative is quietly revised in official Chinese media, if the emphasis shifts from the strategic value of the Iran-oil relationship to the importance of supply diversification, it will signal that the internal political cost of the crisis has reached the level where the narrative needs to be updated, which is the closest Beijing comes to publicly acknowledging a strategic miscalculation. Three things are now irreversible. 1. China's Iran oil dependency has been exposed as a structural vulnerability rather than a strategic asset in a single operational week. The internal assessments that documented this risk for 3 years have been vindicated in the most public and costly way possible. Future Chinese energy planning will operate with a permanently different risk model for supplier concentration. 2. The actual leverage dynamics of the China-Iran relationship have been empirically demonstrated. Beijing could not prevent Tehran from taking an action that directly damaged Chinese economic interests. That demonstration changes how every government that had assumed China could moderate Iranian behavior will approach both Beijing and Tehran going forward. 3. The economic advantage that made the Iran relationship worth its geopolitical risks, cheap discounted crude feeding specialized refineries, has been interrupted at a cost that is already measurable in billions and climbing. Even when the Strait clears, the memory of this vulnerability will price itself into every future Chinese decision about Iran dependency depth. Subscribe. Beijing's procurement moves, its diplomatic communications toward Tehran, and the domestic Chinese energy policy signals are all developing right now. I will track every significant shift the moment it becomes visible. The tankers will eventually move. The strategic lesson they have already delivered will not be unlearned by Beijing, by Tehran, by Washington, or by anyone else who thought they understood exactly who had leverage over whom in this relationship.